gruesome mysteries, they just stick with you. They refuse to go away. And this Black Dahlia case, it's a prime example, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's one of those cases that just seems to capture the imagination, even after all these years.
So we're diving deep into it today. We've got piles of old newspaper clippings, police reports, even some excerpts from a book about the case.
It should be fascinating to see what we can uncover about this whole thing.
And maybe even get a glimpse into the underbelly of Hollywood back in 1947.
Right, because that's the backdrop for all of this. The allure, the darkness, it all seems to swirl around this case.
Exactly. And it's almost like the victim, Elizabeth Short, she was caught between those two extremes.
It's like she walked straight into a nightmare.
A stark contrast to the Hollywood dreams she was chasing.
Exactly. She was young, full of hope, came to Los Angeles wanting to be an actress, just like so many others.
And instead, her story ends in such a horrific, unsettling way.
It's almost hard to believe something this gruesome could happen.
I know, right? But can you imagine being the person who found her? Betty Bersinger, I think her name was?
Just an ordinary woman out for a walk with her daughter.
In her own neighborhood, too. Limerick Park, January 15th, 1947.
A day that would be etched in Los Angeles history.
She thought she saw a mannequin at first. Can you imagine?
It sends chills down your spine just thinking about it. But it wasn't a mannequin, of course.
It was Elizabeth Short's body.
Completely nude, severed at the waist, and posed, almost, deliberately.
And then there's that horrifying detail, the Glasgow smile. Like something out of a horror movie.
It's like the killer wanted to leave a signature, make sure everyone knew this was their handiwork.
It's chilling. And of course, the media at the time, they went crazy with it.
Absolutely. I mean, a murder like that, in Hollywood, it was a media frenzy from the very beginning.
And that's where the name Black Dahlia comes from.
That's right. The newspapers, they latched onto that name, this image of darkness and glamour.
It's a name that's become synonymous with the case itself. But behind the headlines, behind that nickname, there was a real person, Elizabeth Short.
That's what gets lost sometimes in these big, sensational cases.
And her story, it's actually quite heartbreaking when you look at the details.
She was only 22 years old, had bounced around a bit, but always chasing that Hollywood dream,
Trying to make a name for herself, just like so many others who flocked to that city.
Exactly. And she was living a pretty transient life, it seems, like many in that world, struggling to make ends meet.
Not exactly the glitz and glamour that Hollywood likes to portray.
Not at all, and that's what makes the tragedy of it all the more profound. Here's a young woman with hopes and dreams, and her life is cut short in such a horrific manner.
It really makes you wonder about the dark side of that world, what lurks beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And what's even more perplexing is that the LAPD, they went all out on this case, but it still remains unsolved.
I mean, they interviewed hundreds of people, right?
Yeah. Hundreds. Anyone who might have even crossed paths with Elizabeth Short. Friends, acquaintances, family members.
But this was 1947. They didn't have the tools we have today.
Exactly. Forensic technology was in its infancy. No DNA analysis, no fancy databases.
Can you imagine the pressure those investigators were under?
Oh, I can only imagine. Not just to solve this gruesome murder, but to do it with the whole world watching.
And with limited resources, too. It must have been incredibly frustrating.
Absolutely. And then you add in the media frenzy, false leads pouring in, people trying to insert themselves into the case.
It's like something you'd see in a movie.
It really is. And the sources you provided, they even touch on some whispers about the LAPD itself.
Oh, right. There were allegations of corruption within the department at the time, weren't there?
There were. And that just adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
So we've got this tangled web of potential leads, limited technology, a media frenzy unlike anything they'd seen before.
And the possibility that the very people tasked with solving the case might not have been on the up and up.
No wonder this case became such a puzzle. And speaking of puzzles, let's talk about the suspects. Because the sources you provided, they highlight a few names that always seem to come up.
Ah, yes. The suspects. That's where this case takes even more twists and turns. Where do we even begin? Well, there's one name that always seems to rise to the top, Dr. George Hodel.
A doctor? As in, someone who's supposed to heal people. It's like something out of a nightmare.
It's enough to make you wonder about the kind of darkness that might lurk beneath the surface, right?
Absolutely. But what makes this even stranger is that Hodel's own son, Steve, he became convinced that his father was the Black Dahlia killer.
It's a bizarre twist, isn't it? His own flesh and blood.
You can't make this stuff up. So what could possibly lead a son to suspect his own father of such a horrific crime?
It's a question that's haunted Steve Hodel for years, and he's dedicated a significant part of his life to trying to answer it. He's even written a book about it.
Wow. And he actually uncovered some pretty compelling evidence, didn't he? Like stuff suggesting his father had the medical knowledge to pull off those gruesome acts.
That's right. I mean, he was a surgeon, so he knew his way around anatomy.
And then there's that whole thing about the LAPD bugging Hodel's house back in the 1950s. It's like something straight out of a spy movie.
It is. They had hidden microphones in there, and they actually record some pretty incriminating statements.
Wait, so they had him on tape talking about the murder. Why wasn't he charged?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some argue that the recordings are open to interpretation, that they don't definitively prove he killed Elizabeth Short.
So it's a case of the evidence, while suspicious, not being conclusive enough for a conviction.
That seems to be the consensus, yes. And to make things even more frustrating, Hodel died in 1999.
Taking whatever secrets he had to his grave.
Exactly. So we're left with this cloud of suspicion, this nagging feeling that we may never know the full truth. But Hodel wasn't the only one with a possible connection to Elizabeth Short. The sources also point to a man named Mark Hansen.
Hansen, what was his story?
He owned a nightclub, which in 1940s Hollywood wasn't exactly unusual.
True. Lots of those around back then. Okay, so more of a direct link than we've seen with Hodel. Was there anything else that made him a suspect?
Well, for one thing, some of Elizabeth's belongings were found at his place after her death.
Interesting. So it wasn't just a random coincidence that their paths had crossed.
Right. And there were whispers, rumors that Hansen might have been infatuated with Elizabeth Short.
Maybe even a little possessive. It's not hard to imagine that things could have gone wrong.
No, it's not. And the LAPD, they certainly looked into him. But just like with Hodel, there wasn't enough to tie him definitively to the murder.
Another dead end. Or at least an unsolved puzzle.
It's a pattern we see over and over again in this case. But we've got one more name to consider, a less-known individual, Leslie Dillon.
Dillon. What's his story? Another Hollywood hopeful.
He worked as a bellhop, but he fancied himself a writer, and he actually wrote letters to the LAPD claiming he knew details about the murder.
He inserted himself into the investigation. Bold move.
It was. And he actually did have some connections to the entertainment industry. The sources mention he moved in those circles.
So he knew people, claimed to have inside information. There's got to be more to it.
Well, he also had some medical knowledge. He worked as an assistant at a mortuary at one point.
So that might explain how he knew about the way Elizabeth Short's body was treated.
It's possible, yes. But like the others, the evidence linking him to the crime just wasn't there.
Another frustrating dead end.
It seems that way. So we've got these three main suspects, Hodel, Hansen, and Dillon, each with their own quirks, their own possible connections, but no smoking gun.
Right. It's a case that seems designed to make your head spin. But it's not just about the individuals, is it?
That's the thing about the Black Dahlia case. It's like the further you dig, the more complex it gets. And the sources you provided, they delve into some even broader theories as well.
Theories about who might have been behind it all.
Exactly. Theories that go beyond just focusing on one individual.
So it's not just about pinning it on one guy, huh? There are these bigger forces at play, at least according to the theories.
That's what makes this case so fascinating. We've got individual suspects, but then we've got these broader possibilities too. It's like the case itself is a reflection of Hollywood.
Yeah, all smoke and mirrors. Makes you wonder what's real and what's just a facade.
Exactly. And that brings us to the first theory we should talk about. Organized crime.
The mob. Were they really mixed up in Hollywood back then?
It sounds like something out of a movie, right? But the sources, they paint a pretty convincing picture of organized crime having its hooks in various parts of the entertainment industry.
So you're saying Elizabeth Short might have gotten caught up in that world. Maybe she knew too much.
It's certainly possible. The brutality of the murder, the way her body was posed, it does have some similarities to mob-style killings.
Like a message. A warning.
Maybe. We can't know for sure. But the sources definitely raise that possibility. That she stumbled into something, saw something she shouldn't have.
It's a chilling thought. But was there any actual evidence to support that theory? Or is it all just speculation?
That's the thing about this case. There's never a clear-cut answer. There's no smoking gun that directly links the mob to Elizabeth Short's murder.
So it's more of a lurking shadow, a possibility that we can't quite dismiss.
Exactly. It's frustrating, but that's often the nature of these cold cases.
So we've got the mob theory, but it's all circumstantial. What else is there?
Well, there's another theory, even more unsettling, that Elizabeth Short wasn't the only victim.
You're saying a serial killer.
Some experts believe that's a real possibility.
Wow. So the Black Dahlia case, this whole thing, it might just be one piece of a much bigger, more horrific puzzle.
That's what some people believe. The sources mention other unsolved murders in Los Angeles around the same time. Killings with some eerie similarities to the Black Dahlia case.
And maybe back then, without the forensic technology we have now, they just never made the connection.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? Imagine if they'd had DNA evidence back then.
Right, they might have been able to connect the dots, stop this guy before he could hurt anyone else.
We'll never know.
So we're left with these theories, these suspects, these what-ifs. It's almost like trying to see through a fog that never lifts.
And I think that's why this case, even after all these years, it continues to fascinate people. It's a puzzle we desperately want to solve, but those missing pieces, those unanswered questions, they just keep us hooked. It makes you wonder, though, if this happened today, would things be different?
That's a good question. Would all the technology we have now, would it have made a difference? Or would it just make things more chaotic?
It's hard to say. I mean, we have more tools at our disposal, but there's also so much more noise, so much more information to sift through.
It's almost like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. We may never know for sure what difference it would have made. But what we do know is that Elizabeth Short's murder, it's a tragic reminder of the darker side of Hollywood, a place where dreams can quickly turn into nightmares.
And sometimes those nightmares, they linger, even after all this time.
They do. And I think, in a way, by digging into these sources, by talking about this case, by keeping her story alive, that's the closest we can come to justice for Elizabeth Short.
To make sure that she's remembered, not just as a victim, but as a young woman who came to Hollywood with hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
A woman whose life was tragically cut short.
Exactly.